Hello, my friends. I am Konstantin Shenikov-Arkharov. I would like to present you today an interesting lute source, Thibault manuscript. The first lute manuscript appears in the late 15th, early 16th century and belongs to more or less the same time period as first printed lute books, but contains unique repertoire. Some of these manuscripts has an attribution and shed some light on famous lutenists of the era. Another ones, in contrast, are enigmatic. Now we dive more deeply in one of them. Thibault lute tablature is an interesting example of the earliest surviving lute manuscript, most likely written in the first decade of 16th century. The name Thibault assigned to the manuscript after French musicologist Geneviève Thibault de Chambord, who discovered the source and encouraged further studies on it. She found this manuscript in a bookstore in Florence in 1956. We do not know anything about its history, neither who was the author nor compiler, and what was the goal of this book. It might be a lute students or a lute professional gathering where one wrote down the pieces he or she learned by heart as an aid to memory. The collection divided into two sections. The first contains 22 solo pieces, diverse dance forms and ricercari, as well as intabulations of popular songs. Second part contains 86 song accompaniments without solo part. Most pieces in this section are frottole, published by Ottaviano Petrucci between 1504 and 1509, and strangely, canzona by Giovanni Gabrieli, written as a keyboard score. It has been clearly added here later. The manuscript is written in normal Italian tablature carefully enough, aside from some anomalous passages perhaps made in error. The main problem in reconstructing is total absence of rhythm signs and irregular and impractical barring. To reconstruct its music, we can use different tools applying stylistic and counterpoint rules as well as paleography or cryptography. Let's have a look how may this work. Here you see two short dances, a saltarello and a piva. The pieces feature original bar lines, however they have little to do with the actual measures. On the other side we have here dots by the original scribe, which are crucially important and especially helpful for our work. The dot in this period indicates upstroke of either plectrum or any right-hand finger depending on a playing technique, and in both cases show us unaccented notes. Let's go from the very beginning and try to sort things out. What information can we gather for these pieces? First of all, we may assume that the pieces are supposed to be in triple meter due to their genre attribution. By analyzing the harmonic progression, we can figure out metrical units of 3 beats each, which we now can call bars, which corresponds to the bass melodies throughout the entire piece. To subdivide this section into shorter note values, we can make careful use of the dots mentioned above. Look at this example. We can see two sections, which I count as 2 bars. The second one has 3 notes, which fit perfectly in a 3-beat bar and looks more or less like the only way. The first one, however, requires a different interpretation. According to the dots on the second and fourth notes, the third note must be on an accented beat, which leaves us with only 2 preferable possibilities. One of the helpful methods I borrowed from cryptography is recognizing patterns. These motifs we can find several times written exactly the same with the same dots. This does not necessarily tell us that the section must be played exactly the same, but chances are that they were meant to be, and since there is no reason to assume otherwise, I transcribe them the same. During the performance, lutenists can of course allow themselves more freedom and play them differently each time or even add diminutions. On the other hand, we can see motifs that are similar, but which appear to be differently ornamented versions of the same phrase. For my transcription, I tried to find solutions considering their similarities and their comparable functions, but at the same time trying to respect their different contexts. In the following passage, I faced the problem to fit the quantity of notes into regular bars. The first question was, does this equal 1 or 2 bars? According to the musical context, I found 2 bars would be too much of the B-flat sonority, counting several B-flat units before. The next step was to observe the tone repetition and set the whole rhythm accordingly. Finally, I found a solution that convinced, and I made sure that it would work both times the same. In the end, I made 2 decisions, neither of which I could falsify nor prove with strong evidence. The first is in the very beginning. I transcribed the initial chords as an upbeat and a long first beat instead of starting directly with a strong beat. In my opinion, pairs of such an extended chords do not correspond to the movement of a saltarello, creating a heavy feeling that does not fit the dance. Comparing the very beginning with a similar place later in the piece, I found obvious correlations and realized that my decision works in both cases, creating a more natural phrasing for the second time. The second decision was just before this fast cadence passage. The C minor chord, assuming a lute in nominal G tuning, I wrote as an hemiola, which is not an obligatory decision, but a musical one, thus adding some irregularity to the rhythm and making the piece more interesting. A precadential position is a natural place for a hemiola. At a similar place later in the piece, this does not work, so I didn't try to adapt this or change the music. In the piva, one can find similar musical material, but, as is commonly known, it is a faster dance than the saltarello. Therefore, I transcribed it using the bigger measure of a 6/8 and reconstructed the beginning in a similar way to the beginning of the saltarello, bearing in mind how the difference opens out with a different tempo. The same passage also occurs in the piva, but interestingly with another fingering. My first attempt was to consider these dots as a mistake, but since they occurred the same twice, this made me doubt my first assessment and I started to look for another solution. Considering the fast tempo, I decided to transcribe it into 2 bars with longer note values. But the tone repetition still did not appear convincing to me, though we can find similar tone repetition in passages of Capirola lute book, for instance. In Ricardo Leitao Pedro's transcription, I found a musically sensible solution, though it ignores the dots in the last section of the passage. After the studies, I believe I have reconstructed the probable version of the piece. The most mysterious piece in the manuscript evokes an earlier style, a genre and improvisational model made popular in 15th century, the Bassadanza. It bears similarity to Bassadanza from the Pesaro manuscript, but with some unexpected and unexplained twists. Research by Crawford Young contains an analysis of a Pesaro piece and a possible explanation of Thibault's strangeness. Young's points are as follows. Both Bassadanzas might be the same piece, copied from the one and the same source is now unknown. Probably lute teacher gave his music sheet to the students, and students copied it into his and her own collections, which we know nowadays as Pesaro lute manuscript and Thibault lute manuscript. Both are settings of the famous tenor La Spagna, reproduced in Antonio Cornazzano's treatise. Pesaro has copied it precisely, while in Thibault huge mistakes occur. Young depicts this as a simple misreading by Thibault's compiler that he or she made in error going through the lines and pages in a wrong way, which gave us the sections very close to Pesaro but completely in the wrong order. But let's start from the very beginning. In this case, we have a tenor cantus firmus, a melody in tenor range we know nowadays as La Spagna, which used as a basis for the whole composition. The first things we have to find out is where the tenor actually starts and how it fit into the composition. From the dance treatises we know that Bassadanza count in 6, and from Crawford Young's article we know that every tenor note was organized in 12 beats. It fits into 2 measures of the dance. Further steps are similar to Saltarella e Piva. The first thing we have to do is divide the whole piece into irregular bars according to the tenor notes. Next step is to set the shorter note values into a structure of a regular bar. Here I also use a method of recognizing patterns and looking for a common decision. But now I would like to show you most interesting thing related to this piece. As I told you before, there are many correlations between Bassadanza in Pesaro manuscript and Bassadanza in Thibault manuscript. The Thibault piece gives us the same or very close musical material with Pesaro, but it appears in different order, breaking the structure of cantus firmus and making a really weird melodical turns. Thibault Bassadanza has its own musical material as well, not presented in Pesaro piece. How we can explain this? We can suppose Thibault as an independent source and, despite the correlations, count this Bassadanza as, if not completely different piece, merely another version. The second explanation, by Crawford Young, suppose Thibault as a corrupted version of the same piece. His hypothesis explains the misreading in the following way. Originally, the piece was written down on white sheets, one of which was cut at some point to 3 different pages, or just bent the same way. During the process of scribing, Thibault's compiler, instead of reading it across, read each separate page down, confusing the order of sections. Putting things together, I moved into simultaneous contrasting directions and prepared a different editions of the piece, which would allow people to compare and make their own decisions. All my transcriptions and more detailed article you can find on my website, find link below the video. In this last section I'm going to show you some notation features from the manuscript. We can find several signs, some of them are clear enough and common with other sources, some of them are somehow unique. The first sign is vertical line, shows obviously synchronization between bass and cantus parts. The second sign is oblique line, you can find in Capirola lute book as well. Preface of the last tells us this sign means holding the note before it while you play next passages. It can keep the same role in Thibault as it comes in similar circumstances. Another one looks very similar to normal fingering dots, except it comes 100 years too early. Sources of the 16th century use only one dot, considering it as a common to play either upstroke or use any finger against the thumb. Distinction between single, double and triple dot as indication of different fingers begin almost in year 1603 in the School of Music by Thomas Robinson. In a sense, these dots are wrongly positioned, written down on a bass side, not on the diskant as was customary. I can only surmise that it must mean something else. Curiouser still, these dots used very rarely and accidentally. When the music repeats, all the normal signs remains except these dots, appearing only once in the piece. And finally, you see the collection of unclear signs. Researchers has hypotheses for each of them, but there is no conventional decision still. Some signs we can meet in another manuscripts, another ones are more unique. All signs I'm trying to reproduce in my editions. This manuscript is still keeping many secrets, and I have no hope to open up all of them. I'm only enjoying the process of discovering and finding solutions for each spot, each line, and each sign, without arrogant conviction to find the only one way, but with desire to understand anything in the end. One question can come to mind now. Why should we deal with such a doubtful source, since we have more reliable ones? My answer is to expand the context and increase the knowledge of the era. Even such a document can shed some new light on the common repertoire and performance practice. Who knows, maybe such a sources contain some pieces by Pietro Bona or Giovanni Angelo Testagrossa, whom we know only from the legends nowadays.